Auslautverhärtung. Actually, there's two things I want to talk about today. Number one, I want to have a technical discussion on the subject of Auslautverhärtung, what it is and how it works. But I also want to step back and look at language learning in a more general sense and talk about accents. And specifically, the question I want to answer is it a problem, is it a bad thing as a language learner to speak your target language with an accent? If you want to skip the technical discussion and go straight to that question, go to this time code on the screen right now. Otherwise, let's talk about Auslautverhärtung in German and how it works. Das hier ist Lernen und Fahren. So what is Auslautverhärtung? Verhärtung refers to the hardening of something. Here we're using that term figuratively. What we're talking about is consonants. There are certain voiced consonants in German, also called soft consonants, that can transform into their voiceless equivalents, also called their hard equivalents. Now I want to stress, before we get into this, that Auslautverhärtung is a function of the German spoken language only. The German written language does not care about Auslautverhärtung. That means that these words we're going to look at do not change their spelling, even though their pronunciation changes. This is horribly confusing and misleading if you're coming to it for the first time, but also if you even if you're used to the German language. I've received feedback on my pronunciation in German, and the number one thing I hear is that I consistently miss Auslautverhärtung because my brain is wired to think in terms of English pronunciation rules, and when I see a word that is spelled a certain way, I tend to pronounce it that way. But that doesn't work in German because of Auslautverhärtung. So let's take a look at this. The consonants we're talking about are B. The b sound can change to its voiceless equivalent P. D can change from the d sound to its voiceless equivalent T. G can change from g to the hard K sound, k. And V can change from the soft v sound to the hard F sound. Man, I hope the helmet mic is picking that up. Maybe I should have done this on the other channel. But anyway, let's go with it. Let's start with B. B can transition to P. This happens when the consonant in question shows up at the end of a word, or confusingly at the end of a syllable inside a word. Let's take a look at, let's say, abfahren, to depart. Wir fahren ab. It's tempting to pronounce that ab like the first syllable in the English word abnormal or abdominal. It's spelled AB, so you want to say ab, but that's wrong. Auslautverhärtung hardens that consonant sound and makes it voiceless. Wir fahren ab. Now, in my opinion, the B to P transition is the easiest one to fake. If you say it really fast, it's not obvious whether you said B or P. Wir fahren ab. You can just get away with it if you say it really quickly. But let's look at D. The most famous example of the hardening of the D consonant in German is the word und. You'll hear this all the time in German. It's never pronounced und with a soft D at the end. It's und with a hard T. Now this is a problem because there's some words in German that look exactly like English words. Take a look at these two words on the screen. It's tempting to pronounce them the way you'd say them in English. Land, bald. But these aren't English words, these are German words, and we have to honor German pronunciation rules. It's das Land, the same sound as the first syllable in the English word lantern. And it's bald, the same as the first syllable in the English word Baltic. For another example, take a look at these two words. The first one is a conjugation of sein, to be. It's used for third person informal plural, so you'd say something like, seid ihr bereit? Are you guys ready? The second one means since. It's a time specifier, so ich kenne ihn schon seit langer Zeit. Okay, great. But the surprising part here is that there's no pronunciation difference between these two words. They're both pronounced seit. You don't say seid ihr bereit, you say seid ihr bereit. And another example you've probably seen on this channel more than once is das Rad. It shows up in the word das Motorrad. Der Motor means the motor, and das Rad means the wheel. So motor wheel is the German word for motorcycle. I love that word. I've used it as an example many times. But I consistently say it as Motorrad with a soft D at the end because that's how it's spelled. But we've got a problem here. Because of Auslautverhärtung, it's actually pronounced the same as the German word Rat. Der Rat looks like the English word rat, meaning a fuzzy rodent, but no, rat in German is die Ratte, 2 syllables. Der Rat, 1 syllable in German, means the advice or the counsel. This gives rise to what I've always thought is a very strange looking word in German, das Rathaus. When I hear the word Rathaus, I think of like a house that is literally full of rats, but no, that's not what we're talking about. It means the council house. That's what they call City Hall in German. But there's no pronunciation difference between these two words. So das Rad is actually pronounced the same as der Rad, and das Motorrad is actually pronounced das Motorrad. I've been saying it wrong this entire time. Let's move on to G. You have expressions in German like Guten Tag. It's tempting to pronounce that as Tag because there's a G at the end, but it's actually the hard K sound, Guten Tag. And similarly, the V sound can harden as well when it shows up at the end of a word. So you have words like aktiv or attraktiv that look like they should be pronounced that way, but they're not. It's aktiv und attraktiv. But we have a problem here. We have a problem in German. The problem is that a lot of the words we just looked at are adjectives. And that means that they undergo declension. Declension is when a word changes form depending on how you use it in the sentence. And for German adjectives, that means that we stick an adjectival word ending on them, which means that they no longer end with that consonant in question. So, for example, attraktiv. When you use that in a sentence, it becomes attraktive. Sie ist eine attraktive Frau. The F softens back to its V equivalent. But why? Because it's no longer at the very end of the word. The adjectival word ending is now at the end of that word. Similarly, many nouns in German, most of them I think, take a word ending when you pluralize them. For example, let's go back to Tag, Guten Tag. If you pluralize that, you get Tage. Ich habe das mehrere Tage lang gemacht. I've done that for several days. You wouldn't say mehrere Tage lang. Why? Because the G is no longer at the end of the word. It's been superseded by the pluralized noun ending. And similarly, das Motorrad, when you pluralize it, you don't get Motorräder, you get Motorräder. It changes back to the soft D. Okay, that's a lot to absorb, but as long as it's consistent, as long as it only happens at the end of a word, we're okay, right? So take a look at this. The German word for money is spelled Geld, but it's pronounced Geld because of Auslautverhärtung. So how would you pronounce this word on the screen right here? It means wallet. Okay, the D is not at the end of the word, so it should be Geldbeutel, right? Well, no, because the D shows up at the end of a syllable within that word, therefore it's Geldbeutel. It's not just when it shows up at the end of the word, it's at the end of a syllable inside a word. Okay. There's other special cases like IG. How do you pronounce IG in German? Well, that's a bit of a trick question. It depends. If it shows up before a vowel, it's pronounced ig, like the English word twig. So for example, häufiger, more frequent. Häufiger. You don't say häufiger, you say häufiger. It's a soft G sound like g. Okay. But if it shows up before a consonant, it changes entirely. Häufigsten, most frequent. You don't say häufigsten, and you don't say häufigsten, you say häufigsten. Okay, what if IG shows up at the end of a word? How do you pronounce it then? How would you pronounce this word? It means frequent. Is it häufig? Is it häufig? Well, it turns out that's a bit of a trick question too. Even German people can't agree on how to pronounce this one. It depends on where you were raised. This is a regional thing. In standard German, it's pronounced like an ish, häufig. But I've also heard häufig. So if even German people can't agree on how to pronounce these things, what chance do I have as a learner of the German language? It seems incredibly frustrating. Well, let's use that as a segue into the next topic for this video. If you get this wrong, will you be misunderstood? If I said, ich fahre häufig mit meinem Motorrad, am I going to be misunderstood? Is a German person going to look at me and say, I'm sorry, I do not understand what it is you are trying to say? I don't know what that accent was. No, I'm not going to be misunderstood. They're going to understand what I meant. It's just that I'm speaking with an accent. Is that a bad thing? Well, that's a loaded question, and it depends on who you talk to. There are some people who guard their language jealously. They don't like hearing it spoken with a foreign accent, and they will mock you or shun you if you try to speak with a foreign accent. The French are kind of notorious for that, not to pick on anybody in particular. And let's take a giant step backwards for a second and talk about language itself. What is the purpose of language? The purpose of language is to communicate. If you can speak your target language well enough to formulate a thought or to ask a question and then understand what comes back in your direction well enough to formulate another thought or question and go back and forth, you are communicating in that language. You might not be communicating perfectly. The speaker with whom you're talking might have to struggle just a little bit harder to understand you than they would to understand a native speaker, but they can still understand you. So if you can communicate in your target language, you have succeeded. You have achieved the goal of language. You are communicating in that language. Maybe not flawlessly, but you are communicating nonetheless. Over time, gradually you get better. Every time you make a mistake and get corrected, you get a little bit better. At least that's the theory. That's what I said way back in episode 1. I still stand by that, but it can feel awkward at times because you are constantly making mistakes. Case in point, I have been told by more than one German person that I speak German with a noticeable Canadian accent. But I have also been told by more than one German person that it does not present a barrier to communication. They can still understand me when I speak German. They may have to try a little bit harder than they would with a native speaker of German, but they can still understand me. We are succeeding in the goal of language when we communicate in our target language, even if we speak with an accent. So, when you first start out in your target language, you might be speaking with a very heavy accent indeed. You might say things like, "Es wird bald bereit sein." Okay, a German person might not praise me for speaking that poorly, but they would still at least understand me. And over time, you can sharpen that and get to the point where you can say things like, "Es wird bald bereit sein." What's that, Mr. Duck? You have something to say? I know I do, but I'm trying my best here. Look, the point is, you can be clearly understood in your target language, even if you speak with an accent. Surely at some point in your life, you have spoken English with someone who didn't speak English natively, and they had an accent. Did it pose a barrier to communication? Maybe if their accent was super thick, but generally, probably not. You could probably still understand them, even though they spoke with an accent. And now, reverse it. You're speaking someone else's language with an accent. Is it going to stop that person from understanding you? Maybe, if your accent is super thick, but maybe not. Maybe you might be surprised how well you can do even when you're speaking with an accent. So, pop quiz. Is it a bad thing as a language learner to speak your target language with an accent? Hit the pause button if you need more time. Hit the pause button if you need more time. I'm joking, of course. That's a rhetorical question. I can't give you an answer to that one. I can give you my answer to that one subjectively. No, it's not a big deal. You should not let that hesitation, that fear get the better of you. I know I've seen this expressed from language learners in many language learning forums across the internet, that they don't want to speak their target language in front of native speakers of that language because they're worried, I'm going to speak with an accent, I'm going to mispronounce things, they're going to mock me or shun me. But if you follow that hesitation, that fear to its logical conclusion, then you will never speak your target language. Why? Because it's a chicken and egg problem. How can I improve my horrible accent if I never have conversations with people? But how can I have conversations with people if I'm ashamed of my horrible accent? You get locked in this fear where you just will never try. So at some point you have to put that fear to one side and just say, you know what, it's okay. Yeah, I'm going to sound like I don't belong here. I'm going to sound like I don't speak this language natively. You know what, I don't speak this language natively. I'm trying to learn it. So yeah, I'm going to speak with an accent, and that's okay as long as I can communicate in that language. I don't need to communicate perfectly in order to communicate. So yes, you should strive to improve your accent as part of the language learning process. But don't stress over it to the point where you feel like you have to speak as flawlessly as a native speaker, because that could take years or decades or maybe even never. And that's okay. We can still serve the purpose of language without speaking flawlessly, is the point I'm trying to make there. All right, that'll do it for today. We will see you next time on Lernen und Fahren.